If you got your Bibles with you, turn to Mark chapter 5. That's where we're going to be spending most of our time this morning. All right. Thank you for being here today. Thank you to those of you who are joining us online. We are in a series right now studying various events from the life of Christ. And today we're going to look at two miracles that occurred on the same day, or very closely connected. And this occurred in the first year of Christ's ministry. In fact, I'll give you a little bit of context about this. The miracles that we're going to be looking at is Jesus, who heals a woman who has a flow of blood, who touches his garment, and then Jesus raising a little girl for a man who was a ruler at the synagogue in Capernaum. But to begin, let's talk briefly about the Synoptic Gospels. And Synoptic, I know many of you are familiar with this, but some may not be. It has two Greek roots. The first root that's very obvious is optic, meaning to be seen. And we see this in words like optics, optician, etc. The second root is syn, which means together. And we see this in words like synonym or synthesis. So what this means is synoptic means to be seen together. And the Synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And you've got the approximate dates of when these Gospels were written on the slide here. And John was written much later. It's considered the non-synoptic Gospel, if you will. So what we're going to be doing is we'll be basing our study today in Mark chapter 5, but we'll also be looking at material from Matthew and from Luke. The reason being is that you get a fuller picture of what's happening by looking at all of the accounts. Here's one example that comes to mind is the rich young ruler. And the rich young ruler is recorded in the Synoptic Gospels. And we learn from all three of those Gospels that he's rich. But we only learn from Matthew that he's young, and we only learn from Luke that he's a ruler. So this is one of the reasons that we'll be looking at additional Gospels while we look at this morning. So we've got two miracles and three accounts. These are the passages that we'll be looking at today. So Capernaum, to set the stage. When Jesus preached in Galilee, his base was in Capernaum, and Matthew uses this turn of a phrase here where he calls Capernaum his own city in Matthew chapter 9 and verse 1. Here on the map, you can see Capernaum. It's this red dot up here. And what Jesus has just done to set the stage is he has gone across the sea into the western side here, the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. And he has cast out the legion demon that runs into the herd of swine. And he and his apostles are sailing back across the Sea of Galilee, which really it's a big lake. It's called the Sea of Galilee. They're sailing across, and the people in Capernaum can see them coming. They can see them coming, and there's a large crowd that's gathered to see him when he arrives. So in addition to this, we've got a few recent events that have just occurred. Earlier in the chapter in Matthew and in Luke, we read about the centurion who had the faith that came to Christ and wanted his servant healed. Jesus had also calmed the storm on the sea on his way to go cast out this demon, this legion demon. He's healed a paralytic, and he's called Matthew, and Matthew is called in Capernaum. Now, Capernaum is this fishing village that's just on the northern side of the Sea of Galilee there. So the centurion's faith is not in this passage, but it's in a passage before, and I bring it up because there are some connections here that are important to this account. So Matthew chapter 8 and Luke chapter 7 have the account of the centurion who comes and asks for Jesus to heal his servant. And Luke 7, verse 3, indicates that the centurion had sent elders from the synagogue in Capernaum to Jesus to make this request initially. So we're going to come to Jairus, who is an elder in the synagogue. He's a ruler of the synagogue, so he would have been familiar with this particular event. And do you recall what was the remarkable thing about this centurion that Jesus noted? I know we've got masks on. I'll go ahead and fill in the blank because I know a lot of you know the answer to this. He had not found such great a faith in all of Israel, he says. He makes that remark because this man says, there's no need for you to come to my house to heal my servant. Just say the word, and it will be done. And Jesus is amazed at this man's faith. Here he is, a Roman soldier, and he has this incredible faith that Christ can do whatever he says will be done. So in Luke chapter 7, we have this account, and there's this verse. When they came to Jesus, they pleaded with him earnestly, saying, "He's worthy to have you do this for him, for he loves our nation, and he is the one who built us our synagogue." Okay? We have the site of the synagogue that was in Capernaum. This is the synagogue the centurion built. This is where Jairus worked, and this is where Jesus taught. So this is an actual place that you can see and go to in Israel. So Jairus makes his request, and this is recorded in 3 different accounts. Mark 5, then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name. And seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." Okay? Now, Luke tells us that she's 12 years old. And Matthew abbreviates the account. Matthew comes in and says that she's already died. Matthew will skip some things, and he's got the shortest of the accounts related to this. It's not that Matthew's wrong. It's that each of the authors in each of the books has a different target audience and has a different intent. He condenses rather than giving the longer version of this event. The longest versions occur in the book of Mark, which is kind of unusual because Mark is very brief and very terse and very fast. If you read Mark, he uses the word immediately very frequently. He's like the reporter's gospel. And Mark was targeted at a Roman audience, Matthew at a Jewish audience, and Luke at the Greeks. So what is this man, Jairus, what does he give up? What is he doing here? He gives up prejudice. He could have been prejudiced, and prejudice means to judge beforehand. There you've got the definition there, prejudice, right? He's not prejudging Christ, even though he's a ruler of the synagogue. He gives up his pretense. He's a synagogue ruler, but he goes before Jesus. And not only does he go before Jesus, but we're gonna read that there's messengers that come for him later. And how did the messengers know where to find him? He had to tell his family he was going to go see Jesus, okay? And he gives up his pride. He fell at the feet of Christ. So Jairus gives these things up. Moreover, he leaves his dying daughter. I mean, you look at this man's face right here, and I'm sure this actor is doing the best he can to convey what this father must have felt, that his 12-year-old was dying. So what doesn't this man give up? His faith. And this is the thing that connects these accounts here, his faith. So Mark chapter 5, verses 21 through 24. And when Jesus had crossed again to the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name. And seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." And he went with him. And Luke tells us that this was his only daughter. In Luke 8:42, he says, "For he had an only daughter about 12 years of age, and she was dying." So Luke tells us that she was dying. So Jesus is on his way to this man's house to heal his daughter. And the kind of faith that this man has is the kind of faith that we read about in Hebrews chapter 11. And the Hebrews writer tells us, without faith it is impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. So, on the way, Jesus has an interruption. And we can all relate to this. We're about to go do something and we're interrupted. And Jesus always responds with grace to whatever interruptions that come his way. And there's a woman who's going to want to conceal her faith. Luke 8, as Jesus went, the people pressed about him. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years. And though she had spent all her living on physicians, she could not be healed by anyone. Luke is a physician. And Luke shows the most kindness towards the physicians in this account from what happens. Essentially, he's saying she's uncurable. The physicians could not heal her. Mark is a little more harsh on the physicians. And let me just read this account from Mark chapter 5, starting in verse 25. And there was a woman who had had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus, and came up behind him in the crowd, and touched his garment. For she said, "If I touch even his garments, I will be made well." And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. So Mark comes out and says that she spent everything that she had, and despite spending everything that she had, her condition grew worse. So Matthew tells us, and the other authors tell us, what she's thinking in her heart. She comes up behind him, and what's in her mind is, if I only touch his cloak, I will get well. That's what she's saying to herself. If I can just touch his cloak, I will get well. She doesn't want to stop him. She doesn't want to have a conversation with him. She doesn't want a dialogue. She doesn't want to interrupt his day. She just wants to touch his cloak, and he's in a crowd. And so she's encouraged by this anonymity of the crowd. She's got this courage. If I can just touch his cloak, just touch the border of his cloak. And what happens to her? It says, immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. This healing was immediate. Now, this woman, according to Leviticus chapter 15, starting in verse 25, her condition of having this flow of blood would have made her ceremonially unclean for the Jews. Okay? So, when she approaches Jesus trembling, she's got a reason to be in fear, because he's considered a rabbi, and she's unclean, and anything she touches is unclean according to their ceremonial laws in Leviticus 15. So she just wants to conceal this. She's got this faith in her heart, this faith that if I just touch his cloak, I'll be healed. So she comes trembling, and she is conscious of her own unworthiness. And Mark chapter 5, verses 30, let's look at Luke here. Luke 8, and Jesus said, "Who was it that touched me?" When all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the crowds surround you and are pressing in on you." And one of the other writers says, the disciples said, "What do you mean? Who's touching me? Don't you see the crowds are pressing all around you?" There's a little bit of humor in this to me every time I see this, because I'm thinking, what if I was Peter? I might have said the same thing. What do you mean? Who touched me? The question comes on, does Jesus know who touched him? The answer is yes, he does. Absolutely, he knows who touched him. As God in the flesh, he knows who it is. And in Mark chapter 5, starting in verse 30, and Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" Verse 32 has this, "And he looked around to see who had done it." He makes eye contact with her. He knows who it is. It reminds you of when Christ is on trial, and Peter denies him 3 times, and Jesus makes eye contact with him. Remember that incident? He looks over at him, and that's when Peter breaks down and leaves. He makes eye contact with her. So, is Jesus ignorant of who touched him? No. So why does he ask the question? It's the same reason that he winds up asking questions to his disciples when he already knows the answer, and it's to draw out what is the understanding. And in this case, he wants to draw out the confession that this woman's going to make in a minute. He wants to draw out this confession. Mark chapter 5, 33 through 34. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." So she comes in fear and trembling, and Mark says that she told him the whole truth. This is a public confession. Everybody that's there hears what it is that she has to say. Luke records this in Luke 8:47. And when the woman saw that she was not hidden, there you go. She saw it, she was not hidden because he's looking at her. She came trembling and falling down before him, declared in the presence of all the people why she had touched him and how she had been immediately healed. So she's declaring before all the people what just happened. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." Matthew is very short on his summary of this. In Matthew 9:22, he says, "But Jesus, turning and seeing her," again, eye contact, "Jesus, turning and seeing her, said, 'Daughter, take courage. Your faith has made you well.' And at once the woman was made well." So she fearfully confesses her action, and Jesus does not rebuke her. This is probably what she's expecting. I'm unclean. I've touched him. He's going to rebuke me. Instead, he reassures her, and Matthew records this phrase, "Daughter, take courage." Don't be afraid, take courage. And he uses the word daughter. Why would he use that particular word? Likely because she was a Jew. Daughter, take courage. We can't hear the tone of voice, but I can imagine that this is a gentle, reassuring tone that he's using based on his words. He commends her faith. Your faith has made you well. And he gives her a blessing of peace. So she becomes an example of faith to others. And after this event, there were people who begged to touch the fringe of Jesus' garment and were healed. The word spreads, and there are additional instances when this happens. Mark chapter 6, verse 56, Matthew 14, verse 36. By the time we get up to the disciples in Acts, if you recall, they're just wanting to have the shadow of an apostle pass over them. So the faith grows. This woman's initial faith here that she is trying to keep concealed. If I just touch his garment, this becomes an example for many people who are healed afterwards. So she makes this confession, and her shame is removed. And what's the antidote to fear? We're gonna get to that here. The antidote to fear. This will be with Jairus. So I jumped ahead. I'm sorry. Her faith makes her well. He gives her a blessing of peace, and others benefit from this. So, as he's still talking to this woman, Mark chapter 5, verse 35. While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." Belief is the antidote to fear. Faith is the antidote to fear. Here's Jairus. His 12-year-old daughter, she was dying when he left the house. A messenger's come to tell him she's dead. Don't bother the teacher any longer. As a parent, that you could see where that his faith could just die. His daughter's dead, and along goes his faith, right? And Jesus reassures him, "Do not fear, only believe." And in Luke chapter 8, he says, Jesus, on hearing this, answered him, "Do not fear, only believe, and she will be made well." So, though Jairus' daughter had died, his faith did not. So, this is the last slide, but I've got more material. Matthew chapter 9, verses 23 through 26. And when Jesus came to the ruler's house and saw the flute players and the crowd making a commotion, he said, "Go away, for the girl is not dead but sleeping." And they laughed at him. But when the crowd had been put outside, he went in and took her by the hand. And the girl arose, and the report of this went through all the district. Again, Matthew abbreviates the account. Now, it says that there were flute players and a crowd making a commotion. In that culture, mourners were traditionally hired. And when Jesus arrives, he sees them in what one writer calls noisy disorder. And he orders them to leave. And how do they respond to him? They laughed at him. "Go away, for the girl is not dead but sleeping," and they laughed at him. Jesus uses this term, sleeping, and the apostles used it as well, as figurative language to talk about death. One example that you can look to is the example of Lazarus in John chapter 11, verses 11 and 14. He tells the disciples Lazarus is sleeping, and the disciples say, "Well, if he's asleep, then he's going to get better, isn't he?" And he has to be very plain with them. Lazarus is dead. Okay? The disciples wind up using this term later on to talk about death. So Jesus enters the house. And when he enters, he allows only the girl's parents, along with Peter, James, and John, these three disciples. Luke chapter 8, verse 51. And when he came to the house, he allowed no one to enter with him except Peter, John, and James, and the father and mother of the child. And all were weeping and mourning for her, but he said, "Do not weep, for she is not dead but sleeping." And they laughed at him, knowing that she was dead. And then Mark 5 has a similar account here. Now, what's significant about Peter and James and John is that this is the first time that the three of them have been pretty much singled out by Jesus as kind of his inner circle. These three men are the only men who are with him when he performs this miracle. These three men are the only men who are with him who witnessed the transfiguration. And these three men, the night before he dies, are the men that he wants to be with him in Gethsemane. All the disciples go into the Garden of Gethsemane, but then he steps a little further into the garden and just brings the three of them with him. So they had a special place in his heart. Mark chapter 5, starting in verse 38. They came to the house, and the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child's not dead but sleeping." And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in there where the child was. Now in Mark 5, verses 41, we're going to see Mark remembers his audience that he's writing to. He's going to translate an Aramaic phrase into the Greek so that his readers can understand. Mark 5, verse 41. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha cumi," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. Now, Jesus speaks to this little girl in Aramaic. Mark, recording this, is probably recalling Peter's own eyewitness account. Mark was a protege to Peter, and undoubtedly heard Peter preach numerous times, and may have consulted Peter when he wrote the book of Mark. So this phrase, Talitha cumi, was just a simple phrase that parents would use to wake up a child. That's all it was. Luke chapter 8, starting in verse 54. But taking her by the hand, he called, saying, "Child, arise." Luke doesn't even give us the Aramaic. He just says, "Child, arise." He's writing to Greeks. And her spirit returned. Verse 55. This is important. Her spirit returned. What does this tell us? She was dead. It says her spirit returned to her. This is the spirit of life. She was dead. Her spirit returned, and she got up at once. And he directed that something should be given her to eat. And her parents were amazed, but he charged them to tell no one what had happened. So the girl was immediately well enough to get up at once. When Jesus healed someone, the results were immediate. Think about Peter's mother-in-law. Peter's mother-in-law has a fever. Jesus comes in and heals her. And what happens? The next minute she's turning around and she's making food and she's serving them. The paralytic who was healed gets up and can move around, and many others who are made immediately well. That doesn't work that way with doctors today, right? You go to the doctor and you get, a treatment or a medicine, and you'll get better, but it's not right away. So this is just miraculous that he's healed right away. And Jesus does not want this widely reported. And it may be to protect this little girl, to protect this family. If you recall, when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, John records that, well, of course, he's only recorded in John, but in John chapter 12, verses 10 and 11, the Jews sought to kill Lazarus, quote, because on account of him, many of the Jews were going away and believing in Jesus. So it may have been to protect this family. Regardless, Jesus' fame spreads, probably because of the testimony of this woman that touched his garment, because we see later evidence that that's all people wanted to do. So we have reached our time. Thank you very much. Next week will be another lesson from a good teacher. Thanks.